Let me turn to the second part of my remarks. And I'd like to very briefly, then going from my vantage point of the U.S. ambassador in Afghanistan, to identify some of the key policymakers, the key actors and policymakers in the Afghan-Pakistan theater. And what I'm hoping by going over this list is to just give you a sense of the complexity of formulating a very consistent strategy and the difficulty of designing a coherent counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, civilian military campaign. This is not an issue of the United States ambassador sitting down with the United States military commander and we can figure all of this out. This is a complex arena that we're operating within. First of all, on the U.S. mission. The U.S., that is the U.S. Embassy, I said it was the largest in the world at that time. We were administering this huge development assistance budget. But that embassy, when I took it over, was not organically coherent. I reported to the president and had many conversations with him about Afghanistan through the Secretary of State, who I had more conversations about Afghanistan with. But within that embassy, we had 18 different departments and agencies of the U.S. government that come together and form the embassy team. But each one of those heads of agencies in that embassy are reporting directly back to their secretary in Washington, D.C. So I have my agricultural head of mission. He's got 60 agricultural experts on the ground, and he reports directly back to the Secretary of Agriculture. And the same with my Department of Justice team, going straight back to the Attorney General, and so it went. So my challenge then was very much, when I became the ambassador, to try to forge a unified team and to emphasize collective action. And what I did in order to try to achieve that end was I'd offer those department and agency heads in my embassy a lot of access to their secretary, which they liked, but I was always with them when those conversations were going on. And I would go back to Washington frequently, and I'd meet with cabinet heads, and they quickly perceived that I was their biggest champion on the ground in Washington. So you read about U.S. Embassy, don't necessarily say that's a tight black box, not necessarily. Secondly, the U.S. military and the military, the United States and NATO, led by the U.S. military commander in Afghanistan. Very well resourced, extraordinarily capable. They have communications, they have mobility, they've got planning capacity. Focused on security, but with the adoption of the counterinsurgency doctrine, which becomes much more prominent in their thinking in about 2007, but really gets a boost then in 2009 with the arrival of General McChrystal, the military becomes much more ambitious in terms of governance and development programs. Military, a tendency to focus on stability versus long-term sustainability, which is what the embassy team is focusing on. And there's an emphasis on expediency. Third, the United States government in Washington, D.C. I'm being broad here. This is both the executive and Congress together. And what I would tell you is, as I went in 2009, there was actually a surprising degree of consensus on the direction of the war, what had to be done, but there were very significant, sharp debates on differences of levels of effort, how much effort should be applied, and what were the ultimate goals that we were trying to achieve, especially with respect to state building. So at this time, though, given the backdrop in the United States of concerns with what was perceived to be eroding economic strength, the need to rebalance our armed forces after a decade of intense combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, the growing awareness of the potential dependency trap in Afghanistan, and the steady decline in the American people's support for the war, no one in Congress, no one in the administration was urging, after the president made his decisions on surge, no one was urging that we have more to follow the surge. That much was agreed upon. But arguments, again, about ends, ways, and means, they did ebb and flow. So at military headquarters across the street from the U.S. Embassy, there were phone calls going back to Washington and to Congress, and believe me, at the United States Embassy in Kabul, we had calls going back to Washington and Congress. So an attempt to unify the civilian-military effort, but there was also direct reporting going back. Fourth, the Afghan government. Talking about Karzai right now, President Karzai's administration. Very different views on the strategy that we should be following in Afghanistan, a great ambivalence about the U.S. presence, and a tendency on his part and the Afghan political elite's part, of course, to see politics as they were. Whereas if you're in the United States Embassy, you see the politics through the prism of institutions that we're trying to build that don't yet exist. So we have a vision. We want that vision to be realized. We talk about institutions. The Afghans, pragmatic, living in the here and now. They want to talk about power brokers and distribution of power outside of institutions that are immature. Fifth, the Afghanistan beyond the Karzai administration. So many groups in Afghan society whose inclusion in the political process is viewed as essential to the growth of democratic governance, but whose support from the embassy and the military leads to tensions with President Karzai. Examples: support for gender issues, support for women, support for the building of parliament, more. So these outside actors, outside of the Karzai administration, women, minority groups, parliament, they're looking to the United States Embassy for support. And what we become is the loyal opposition, because there is no loyal opposition at this early stage of Afghan political development. 6, NATO ISAF troop contributing countries, let's say in the main, generally risk averse, eager to withdraw, following the U.S. lead, being good NATO allies. They're there with us, but hopefully will be going home soon in their thinking. Neighboring actors, a 7th group. I mentioned those earlier: Pakistan, India, Russia, increasingly China. Very different interest and views on the long-term U.S. presence. And then 8th, the United Nations mission in Afghanistan, which has generally, in my view, been extraordinarily well led. They're important in keeping all these diverse actors, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, Pakistanis, keeping them all inside of the tent, committed to the modernization of Afghanistan, actually committed to democratic reform, also needing, interestingly, to be seen always as even-handed. So questions of civilian casualties, they would be ready, as they should, to criticize U.S. actions that led to civilian casualties and to criticize Taliban actions. And sometimes that would cause tension between the United States and the UN mission. So I wanted to go over that constellation of actors, as I call them, just to give you a sense of how complicated policymaking might be with regard to Afghanistan and Pakistan.